Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. David Glassner, Superintendent of Shaker Heights City Schools. Thank you again for being here. As I think many of you already are aware, I'm here to provide an update related to our planning for the 2020-2021 school year. I provide these updates twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3 p.m. each day. And we try to answer questions that are submitted in advance. You can submit questions in advance on our website. You are also welcome to submit questions via the Zoom chat panel or on the Facebook Live panel. While we can't answer those questions live, we do monitor them and we'll try to answer them at a future update. Today I'm going to be, in addition to answering some of the questions, I'm going to be walking through some of the models, or really the model that we've been spending a lot of time over the past few days working to flesh out a little more, and I'll give some reasons about why this model and at what grade level and all those things. I'll share some slides to provide some information about that. And then I will try to get to some questions as well today. Before I jump into that, I do want to just provide some general updates. I know we keep saying this, that we're expecting the state to issue guidance for K-12 school settings. Right now, we had thought that it was going to be released today. We are hearing that it's now going to be released on Thursday. I can say that we believe it's coming imminently. And of course, our planning continues even in the absence of those guidelines. I think our plans will certainly align with whatever guidelines are released. That said, we're still waiting for those guidelines to put some things in place and to make some final decisions and determinations. Also, I'm excited to share that we are working on transcribing these updates. I know that's a request that we've gotten from several of our community members and viewers. We're still working on the details and hope to have more information about transcription and where you can see the transcription or read the transcription of these video messages in the near future. I hope to have an update on Thursday at my summer update message. I also wanted to just kind of give everybody a sense of what's been happening since the last time I gave an update last Thursday. We have been spending a great deal of time delving into the details of various models and different plans and different logistical questions. Those meetings have really been taking place kind of all day, every day. And thank you to everyone who's been participating and working on continuing to hammer out different scenarios for the fall. We also, members of work group leaders and members had an opportunity to meet with our Family Advisory Committee yesterday evening and again this morning. Also had a chance to share some details with members of the Educational Equity Policy Implementation Advisory Team that met earlier today. And so we've been continuing to get feedback about this plan. I may have mentioned this in an earlier update. We've also had an opportunity to meet with leadership from our Shaker Heights Teachers Association and leadership from other collective bargaining units, and those conversations and collaboration is of course continuing. One question that I know has come up is we had issued a staff survey to get a sense of where staff falls in terms of returning to work when school reopens. I may have mentioned this earlier. We do expect to provide a more detailed summary of the staff survey later this week to our Board of Education members in our weekly board packet. Generally, though, the trends that we have is that approximately 1/3 of our staff is very comfortable returning to work, 1/3 of our staff is unsure, would like more information, and 1/3 of our staff is uncomfortable returning to work. Of course, as we start going into more detailed planning for the fall, we will be working with our staff and faculty on a case-by-case basis to ensure that all of our staff and faculty is safe and healthy in our school buildings. Speaking of health and safety, A question that is continuing to emerge is related to the very specific health and safety protocols that we expect to have in place when school buildings reopen. Uh, that's something we're working on, and as I mentioned, we're waiting for state guidance. So it's hard for us to commit to specific health and safety protocols prior to seeing that guidance. I will say that questions that we are discussing relate to masks. That's been a topic that I know is on the forefront of everybody's mind. Who is required to wear masks? What kind of masks or face shields is the school district providing? What happens when somebody doesn't wear a mask? Visitor protocols is another health and safety question. Who can come into buildings, in what cases, how will they be monitored or assessed to ensure that there are no issues with spreading the virus. Exact physical distancing requirements is still something that is being discussed. So I know we've gotten used to 6 feet of physical distancing is the right number. There are different variations that we're seeing now come out in other state guidelines and other medical guidelines, whether 6 feet needs to be maintained at all times or just maybe most of the time. And then the last question related to health and safety guidelines, that is something that we're kind of discussing on an ongoing basis and waiting for additional guidance on, relates to transportation and how many students we can accommodate on each bus. What does that mean? What other health and safety protocols do we need to have for our buses when we transport students? Those are just some of the health and safety protocols and guidelines, or questions around health and safety protocols and guidelines that we have been discussing. With that, I want to take this opportunity now to dive a little more deeply into the models that we are looking at for the fall. I'd like to preface these comments or this update by reminding everybody that this is still very much a draft version of a plan. Nothing is set in stone. We have not dismissed any plan yet or any plans yet, and we're still considering all of our options. But I did want to let our community know where we're kind of spending more of our time at this point, what we're exploring in a little more depth, and what we're trying to flesh out a little more, since I think that will be helpful. So I'm going to share a presentation here. And this presentation, I will share, like I said, specific models that we are considering. So overall, the models that we have looked at really fall in 3 categories. First, a hybrid model. And I should add, because I know people always have questions about this, the model that's not listed on here is a in-person 5-day-a-week model. We have been exploring and continue to explore that option, but I will say that that is looking increasingly unlikely as a possibility because of space and staff challenges that are really very difficult given all the health and safety protocols we have to meet. So the 3 models that we are really moving towards, the first is a hybrid model. This would be a combination of in-person and virtual instruction that adheres to physical distancing and safety guidelines. The second is a full virtual model, like we had in the spring, when schools are required to close for in-person instruction and we have to move to full remote instruction. I will say, just to be clear, that I would expect that whatever model we end up with, we want to make sure that there is flexibility and agility to move between number 1 and number 2, between those 2 models on an easy basis, and be able to do that, to go back and forth between those models frequently if necessary or smoothly as needed, because we imagine that it is possible that we will start in a hybrid model but then be required to go to a full virtual model, either across the district or in specific classes or specific buildings or grade levels. The third model, or the third scenario, is a Shaker Virtual Academy. This is for students who, for whatever reason, are unable to attend school in person at all. This would be full-time virtual online instruction for an identified length of time that a student and their family would enroll in. and would not include any in-person learning. And I'll talk a little bit about these different models in a little more depth. There are some guiding principles that have been guiding our work. First and foremost is student and staff health and safety. I think many of you have been watching the news and you're aware that the number of COVID cases in Ohio and specifically in Cuyahoga County continue to rise. So this is of great concern for us. And we know that in order to do anything in person next year, student and staff health and safety has to be the first priority. Our district strategic plan is also guiding our work as we think about what we are offering for students, how we're offering courses for students. Educational equity and the International Baccalaureate Framework are the pillars of our strategic plan. So that is, of course, guiding our work as well. All right, so I'm going to jump into the plans that we've been focusing on. At the kindergarten through fourth grade level, we are right now exploring more fully what we are calling an A-B hybrid model. This is an A week or B week model, which means that students would be in person for a week of instruction and then would be in a virtual learning environment for a week of instruction. So those just alternate, an A week and a B week. On days when students are not attending school in person, they will participate in virtual instruction. Virtual instruction will include an established schedule, synchronous and asynchronous learning, project-based assignments, written work, and non-screen learning. You know, one of the things that we learned from this past year is that when students are in a virtual learning model, that learning needs to be more robust, more scheduled, more similar to an in-person school day. And so that's something that we are making sure to include in this model. There are a couple of things I want to talk about that are specific to this model. First of all, I can explain a little bit about why we decided to move towards this model for a couple of reasons. Number one, this maximizes the amount of in-person instruction a student has over the course of a month. We also believe that it's important for students to have consistency. We think that's important for students and families. We know childcare is a great concern for us and for families. And we believe that if we can have students in school one week, out of school the next week, that there is, while of course that's not ideal, at least that consistency makes it easier for students to get used to when they're in school, when they're out of school, and also for families to arrange childcare. Also, from a spacing and staff perspective, this allows us to ensure that we're able to maintain physical distancing in our classrooms, that we're able to maintain appropriate staff to student ratios. Right now, the way we've drafted the model, and like I said, of course, things can change, but I just want to be clear that students would have shaker teachers. They would currently, in the way the model is drawn up, they would have an in-person teacher and a virtual teacher. And those teachers wouldn't likely be the same. So if I have Mr. Smith when I'm in person, he's my second grade teacher. When I'm in my virtual week, I may have Miss Johnson, and Miss Johnson will be my virtual teacher for that entire week. If we end up having to move to a full virtual model because we're going back into an extended closure period, I would go back with Mr. Smith. My in-person teacher would then take over as the virtual teacher. So I know this may be getting into lots of details for people, but I just wanted to make sure that it's clear where we are. One of the questions that we're still working on with this model is how specials fit into this model, how students would be able to engage in learning outside of their core subject areas. It's something that we're, of course, going to make sure happens, just a question of exactly how. I did not mention pre-kindergarten here. That is also something that we're looking at. There are some unique circumstances related to pre-kindergarten, so I'm not going to focus on that for this update, but hope to address pre-kindergarten programming in a later update. For Woodbury, grades 5 through 6. We are also looking at an A-B hybrid model. Again, you know, students would be in person for A week and then in a virtual setting for B week. Very similar to what I discussed in our K4 model. Um, Again, it would allow us to maintain physical distancing, would allow us to have appropriate staff-student ratios, would enable us to use appropriate space. And again, like I've mentioned before, when students are not in person, they will have rigorous, robust virtual learning that will include an established schedule, synchronous and asynchronous learning, project-based assignments, written work, and on-screen learning. And like the K-4 model, students would have shaker teachers, both in person and in virtual settings. You're probably noticing a theme here. Middle school would be similar. We're focusing, or we're exploring more fully, the A-B week model. Again, 5 full days of in-person instruction every other week. And again, when students are not in person, they will have virtual instruction that will include all the things that I've mentioned before. We believe that it's important that we have a similar or the same model from kindergarten through 8th grade so that families can plan accordingly. We want to make sure in school and out of school at the same time if possible. That is something that we are taking into account, that we will try as best as possible to accommodate siblings in a family that spread out over multiple grade levels, so that their schedules are in sync when possible. The high school, of course, is a very different kind of school to plan around and plan for. Currently, we are looking at a model we're calling a 3/4 hybrid model. The reason for that is because students will be in school 3 days a week, in person, 4 hours a day. So again, just to review, at the high school model, the high school level, the model that we're considering right now, we're exploring more fully, is a model that has students in person at the high school 3 days a week for 4 hours each day. In this model, students will take 3 or 4 classes each semester and a total of 6 to 8 classes in the year. Currently, the way we're looking at this model, classes that were annualized before, classes that took place over the course of an entire year before, will now be consolidated into a semester. So just for example, if I had physics, a year-long physics course, now I would have a semester-long physics course that would have twice the amount of time in one semester. So it would still be about the same amount of time. It would just be consolidated into one semester instead of over a full year. Like with the other models, virtual learning will take place when students are not in school for in-person learning. The virtual learning will be supplementing the courses that are in person. So if I have physics in person, my virtual learning will be physics related. And of course, this would be taught by Shaker staff. Just to be clear, students would be broken into 3 different assigned groups, and each group will have in-person learning 3 days a week for 4 hours a day. You may have, my group might have in-person learning Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday mornings, and then another student's group might be Tuesday afternoon, Wednesday afternoon, and Thursday afternoon. It allows us to make sure that we're able to keep that physical distancing in place when students are in person. I also want to touch on the virtual academy. We are still fleshing out the details of the virtual academy. I divided this slide up into grades K through 8 and 9 through 12 because there are some differences in the way we're thinking about the virtual academy, but there are also some similarities. So one of those similarities is that if you decide to enroll your child in the virtual academy, we expect that you would likely be enrolling them for a minimum or specific time frame. So for example, if you're enrolling in the virtual academy, you will likely be committing to enrolling in the virtual academy for a semester or a quarter. We're still trying to figure it out, but the virtual academy is not meant to be a place where you attend for a week or a couple of days and then you go back to your in-person. Or if, for example, a student gets sick, it's not meant to be a place where for those 2 weeks that a student may be quarantined, they go to the virtual academy. It is really a set time frame that you are enrolled in the virtual academy. For students in grades K through 8, we expect that the virtual academy will include a combination of synchronous and asynchronous learning with Shaker faculty, and that intervention or support services will be provided for students as needed. For grades 9 through 12, it's a little different. For those of you familiar with our Innovative Center for Blended Learning, it's more or less based on that model, where students would engage with online courses that are created typically by a third-party provider, usually with some support from Shaker faculty. So for grades 9 through 12, the online course library would serve really as the basis or the foundation for the course curriculum. And like in grades K through 8, intervention and support services will be provided as needed. So as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, this work is still very much in draft form. We are still working out lots of details, but I did want to give some insight into where we are spending most of our time at this point. With that, I'm going to jump into questions. Since I know I spent a majority of the presentation so far giving an update on where we stand, I may not be able to get to all questions today, but again, I encourage people to continue to submit questions, and we will answer them as soon as we're able to. So question number 1, first couple questions really have to do with virtual settings and the virtual academy. Thank you so much for moving forward with the virtual academy. Those of us with high-risk families are grateful. Has the district considered using that model for all students? If we divest ourselves of the idea that school happens in school buildings until, say, January, we could leverage all of the Shaker school space to find safe, socially distanced, and other support for children most vulnerable during the school day. So I am gathering that this question really focuses on trying to make sure that we have virtual academy or virtual options for all students, and that may be something that we do for all students. We have talked about the need, so I guess a couple of things. First of all, in all of our models, virtual settings are certainly included. If we're in a hybrid model, we're building the hybrid model with the understanding that there is a likelihood that some or all of our students will need to be in a virtual setting at some point this school year. We have also talked about having all students start the year virtually, or some grade bands start the year virtually. We also recognize that it's really important for students to be in person if possible. We know that for not just student academic growth, but also for social and emotional and mental health and well-being. And so we are trying to plan for the possibility that we'll be able to have students in person, while acknowledging that there will be students and families who want to take advantage of an all virtual setting. The next question is very similar. At what point would it be appropriate to reverse the plan and have virtual school be the norm for Shaker students and in-person school be just for those with extenuating circumstances, so that there's space for those who truly need it? The risk of COVID is less than the risk of being away from the supports that school provides. You know, we will certainly be working with the Cuyahoga County Board of Health and other medical experts to determine if we need to go into a virtual model. You know, we're already aware of school districts in this area and beyond who, even just with athletic programming, maybe have to shut down some athletic programming or all athletic program because an individual that's participating in the athletic program received a positive test. We recognize that that is a possibility. Currently, though, as I mentioned, we are trying to find ways to have students in person who would like to be in person, knowing that you know, some students may not choose to do that. We also, you know, this question also talks about students who may need to be, who have extenuating circumstances, who truly need to be in person. We do recognize that some students have different needs coming in. All of our students are probably behind where they would have been at the end of last year if the pandemic hadn't happened, but there may be students who need some additional supports or extra interventions or enrichment that we want to make sure we provide in our models as well. And I hope to provide additional information about that at a later update. When will more details be made available about how the virtual academy is structured? When do families need to sign up by? Can families change their mind and either leave virtual to return to school or vice versa if the setup they initially chose isn't meeting their child's needs? We are still fleshing out the virtual academy. I hope that when we publicize our models within the next week or so, that we will have more information about how to enroll in the virtual academy. We don't yet have a specific date for enrollment in the virtual academy, but hope to have that information soon. This question also asks whether families can change their mind and leave virtual or to return to in-person school or vice versa, or to the hybrid model. Currently, like I said, we expect that if you enroll in the virtual academy, you are committing to a specific time frame. Part of that is because we're building ratios for our students and staff that are based on the numbers of students we have. So if students start transitioning from the virtual academy to in-person learning, that may affect our in-person ratios and may be challenging to really provide the kind of, well, really trying to merge the student back into the in-person setting. It may be easier for students to go from in-person to virtual, but that's something that we're still working on. I hope to have more information soon when we're able to flesh out the virtual academy in more detail. I'm going to get to a couple more questions because we're nearing the half-hour mark, and then I'll get to other questions down the road. Will teachers be expected to manage both the classroom at school and virtually, or will teachers pair up and one manages at-home kids and one manages classroom kids? It seems like a lot to handle if the teacher has to do both in-person and virtual learning environments. Currently, in the models that we built out, particularly in the K-8 settings, we are exploring or leaning towards there being an in-person teacher and a separate virtual teacher. So again, I'll use my example of a second grade student. A second grade student may have Mr. Smith when he or she is in person for that A week, and then on the B week, when the student is in a virtual setting, they may have Mrs. Johnson. And those are two separate teachers. Mrs. Johnson may be that virtual teacher. She may be a virtual teacher for lots of students, not just for a small group of students. So maybe most or all of second grade students will have Ms. Johnson as a virtual teacher. That's something that we're still working on. If the district adopts the hybrid 2-1-2 model, would the virtual learning time be led by someone other than the student's in-person teacher? So I think I've already answered that question. Or would teachers be doing both in-person and virtual teaching on the same day? The last question I'm going to answer relates to full-time elementary. Are you considering have the elementary school students go full-time, since the American Academy of Pediatrics guidance strongly advocates that children are present in the classroom and that COVID transmission is uncommon, and that since the downside of remote learning for the youngest ones is so significant that even if physical distancing is not possible, they should be in the classroom. So as this question alludes to, the American Academy of Pediatricians recently released guidance related to school in person in the fall. The guidance that we have looked at, certainly I know the American Association of Pediatricians is advocating for in-person school as much as possible. And we are working towards that. I think there are also some nuances to that guidance that we're looking at more closely. We recognize that it is important for students to be in person, like the pediatricians recommend. And we recognize that it's important that we maintain student and staff health and safety in our buildings, and that we have to kind of achieve a balance of those two things. I'm glad that you asked the question and just wanted to make sure that I was able to address that. As I mentioned before, health and safety guidelines, we expect to have a little more information over the next few days and week, particularly as the state guidance comes out. I know that there are probably still some questions related to that, and then we're working on that. I also, just to kind of reiterate or reinforce what our time frame is, our goal is to be able to publicize a plan, at least a pretty detailed plan to the public, hopefully by the first week in July. I know that's coming up soon, but at some point next week. I would say at this point that we're still on target to meet that goal. If anything changes, I will be sure to let you know. Thank you, everybody, for participating in today's update. As always, this update will be posted on our website, shaker.org. And the next update I will be providing is this Thursday at 3 p.m. Thank you and have a great afternoon.